The last Saturday in August 2014 dawned hot and heavy over the manicured lawns of Maple Creek, Ohio. For Sarah Jenkins, a 38-year-old mother of two, it was a day designated for battle. Her nemesis was the garage, a cluttered cavern of forgotten hobbies, outgrown toys, and the general debris of a life well lived. She pulled her blonde hair back into a practical ponytail, the familiar scent of her coffee mingling with the sweet aroma of freshly cut grass wafting through the open kitchen window. Her husband, Mark, was inside with their children, 10-year-old Emily and 7-year-old Josh, their laughter a cheerful soundtrack to the mundane weekend chore that lay ahead. It was a perfectly ordinary morning, indistinguishable from 1,000 others, a fact that would later become the most haunting detail of all. "I'm going to tame the beast," Sarah had announced with a theatrical flourish, grabbing a pair of worn gardening gloves. Mark smiled from the living room couch, engrossed in the morning cartoons with the kids. "Call me when you surrender. We'll order pizza for lunch," he'd replied, not looking up. The slam of the kitchen door leading to the garage was the last time he would hear from her. The space was packed to the gills, sunlight struggling to pierce through a grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. The air inside was thick with the smells of motor oil, old paper, and the faint, earthy scent of potted soil from gardening projects long since abandoned. Sarah began her work with a determined energy, the classic rock station on an old portable radio providing a rhythmic backdrop. She started with a tower of cardboard boxes filled with old baby clothes, the soft, faded fabrics sparking brief flashes of memory, the tiny sweaters Emily had worn, the little blue shoes Josh had taken his first steps in. A wave of maternal nostalgia washed over her, a gentle bittersweet ache. She carefully folded each item, creating one pile to donate and another to keep, a tangible sorting of her family's history. The task was overwhelming, but there was a quiet satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos. Inside the house, life continued its placid rhythm. Emily was meticulously drawing a family portrait at the kitchen table, while Josh was constructing a fortress of Lego bricks on the living room floor. Mark dozed off for a few minutes, the television humming in the background. The familiar domestic sounds were a comforting bubble, a world away from the dusty solitude of the garage. No one heard any unusual sounds, no shouts, no screams, no screeching tires on the asphalt outside. The neighborhood dogs remained silent. The day was utterly, terrifyingly normal. Around 12:30 p.m., Mark woke with a start. The cartoon credits rolling on the TV, his stomach rumbled, and his thoughts turned to the promised pizza. "Kids, go wash up for lunch," he said, stretching as he walked to the kitchen door. "I'll go get your mum." He slid the door open and stepped into the sudden dimness of the garage, the change in light making him blink. The radio was still playing softly, a forgotten melody in the oppressive quiet. "Sarah," he called out, his voice seeming to be swallowed by the clutter. He saw the box of baby clothes she had been sorting, one pile neat, the other still a jumble. A single, tiny pink sock lay on the concrete floor, a stark splash of color against the grimy gray. Her gloves were tossed beside the box, as if she had just taken them off for a moment. Her car keys and purse were still on a hook by the door to the kitchen. Her minivan was parked in its usual spot in the driveway. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the profound and unnerving absence of his wife. A prickle of unease crawled up Mark's spine. "Sarah, honey, are you hiding?" he called out again, his voice now laced with a tremor of anxiety. He walked the length of the garage, peering behind a large heavy workbench and a stack of old tires. He checked the small side door that led to the backyard, finding it securely locked from the inside. The silence that answered him was absolute, broken only by the tinny sound of the radio. The garage, once a symbol of domestic clutter, suddenly felt vast, empty, and menacing. Panic began its icy creep into his veins. He rushed back into the house, his face pale. "Have you seen Mummy?" he asked the children, his voice strained. Emily and Josh just shook their heads, their innocent faces reflecting his own growing confusion. He ran upstairs, checking every room, his calls of her name growing more frantic. He checked the closets, the bathrooms, even the attic. The house was a tomb, offering no answers, only echoing his own fear back at him. Mark raced back outside, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scanned the street, a quiet suburban lane dotted with identical houses and neatly trimmed hedges. A neighbor was watering his flowers, Another was walking his dog. He asked them, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "Have you seen Sarah, my wife? She was just in the garage." They both offered confused negatives. No one had seen her leave. No one had seen any cars come or go. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the humid Ohio air. Standing alone in his driveway, the world spinning around him, Mark looked back at the open garage door. It loomed like a dark, gaping mouth, holding a terrible new secret. The unfinished task, the sorted clothes, the lone pink sock on the floor. It was a scene frozen in time. The last moment before his world fractured, he pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial. The 911 call he made at 12:47 p.m. marked the official beginning of a mystery that would consume his family and baffle investigators for more than a decade. The wail of a siren, a sound so alien to their quiet street, sliced through the afternoon calm, drawing curious neighbors from their homes. The first patrol car from the Maple Creek Police Department arrived within minutes. Officer Davis, a man whose daily routine usually involved traffic stops and noise complaints, stepped out into a scene of surreal domestic stillness, shattered by an undercurrent of raw panic. He found Mark on the front lawn, his face a mask of disbelief, while Emily and Josh watched from the doorway, their small faces etched with the fear they couldn't possibly comprehend. The initial questions were standard, but felt like accusations. "When did you last see your wife, Mr. Jenkins?" Officer Davis asked, his pen poised over a small notebook. "Did you have an argument? Is there any chance she just went for a walk to clear her head?" Mark, struggling to form coherent sentences, could only shake his head, repeating that she was just cleaning the garage, that her purse and keys were inside. Every logical explanation was a dead end. Sarah hadn't been depressed. She didn't have a history of leaving without notice. She was a devoted mother who would never ever have willingly walked away from her children. The initial search was methodical, yet frantic. Officers fanned out, combing through the Jenkins backyard, peering over fences, and checking the small wooded area at the end of the cul-de-sac. K-29 units were called in, their powerful noses tracing Sarah's scent from the garage to the edge of the driveway, where it abruptly vanished. It was a confounding detail. The dogs could find no trail leading away from the property, no indication that she had gotten into a car or walked down the street. It was as if she had reached the end of her driveway and simply ceased to exist. Asterisk as dusk began to bleed across the sky, casting long, eerie shadows. The house was no longer a home, but a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the property, its stark color a garish wound on the familiar landscape. Inside, forensics technicians dusted for fingerprints and photographed every room, their impersonal efficiency a stark contrast to the family's crumbling, emotional state. The children were taken next door to a neighbor's house, shielded from the clinical intrusion but not from the terrifying reality that their mother was gone, and men with cameras and strange equipment were looking for her in their home. Detective David Miller arrived as night fell. He was a veteran of the force, a man with weary eyes that had seen the worst of human nature, yet he carried an air of quiet compassion. He walked Mark through the garage, a space that had now been officially sealed. The air hung thick and stagnant. Miller noted the details: the radio, now silent, the half-sorted box of clothes, the undisturbed dust on most surfaces. He listened patiently as Mark recounted the morning's events, his voice cracking with a mixture of grief and frustration. Miller knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was not a simple case of a person wandering off. The first night was an abyss of sleepless terror. Mark sat in the sterile quiet of a neighbor's living room, the muted television flickering meaninglessly in the corner. Every creak of the house, every distant car engine, sent a jolt of false hope through him. He replayed the morning over and over in his head, searching for a missed clue, a forgotten detail, a wrong note in the symphony of the ordinary. What had he missed? What sound had he failed to hear? The questions were a relentless torment, a chorus of self-blame that would echo for years to come. For Emily, the silence was the worst part. She lay in a strange bed in a strange room, straining her ears for the familiar sound of her mother's footsteps in the hall, the soft click of her bedroom door opening. She clutched the family portrait she had drawn that morning, the smiling stick figure of her mother, a painful relic from a world that no longer existed. The absence of her mother was a physical presence, a heavy blanket of wrongness that smothered the very air she breathed. She just wanted her mum to come and tuck her in. The search of the garage, continued under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. Detective Miller, methodical and meticulous, conducted his own walkthrough. He saw what the other officers had seen, a scene of mundane activity, abruptly halted. But Miller's eye for detail, honed by 2 decades of investigations, caught something else. Near the base of the heavy, immovable workbench that was pushed against the back wall, he saw it, a faint, thin scratch mark on the dusty concrete floor, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It was straight, about a foot long, and seemed fresher than the surrounding scuffs and stains. He crouched down, his flashlight beam isolating the mark. It didn't seem to be from something being dragged. It was too clean, too linear. He photographed it from several angles, a knot of professional curiosity tightening in his gut. It was a detail that meant nothing and everything all at once, a tiny aberration in a scene that was otherwise bafflingly normal. What could have made such a mark? And why was it here, in the one place Sarah was last known to be? In the days that followed, the silence in the Jenkins home became permanent. The police cars left, the yellow tape came down, but the quiet remained, a constant, screaming reminder of Sarah's absence. The echoes of her laughter were gone, replaced by the hushed whispers of concerned relatives and the hollow sound of Mark's footsteps on the stairs. Detective Miller had his one enigmatic clutha scratch on the floor, but it led nowhere. As the initial, frantic search wound down with no results, a new colder silence began to settle in, the silence of a case and a family going cold. The first few weeks after Sarah's disappearance were a blur of organized chaos and desperate hope. Hundreds of volunteers from Maple Creek and surrounding towns descended on the community. Their bright orange vests a stark contrast to the somber task at hand. They combed through fields, forests, and creek beds, their determined faces a testament to a community rallying around one of its own. Flyers bearing Sarah's smiling phaser photo from their last family vacation were stapled to telephone poles and placed in the windows of every local business, her image becoming a ubiquitous, heartbreaking fixture of the town. Detective Miller and his team worked tirelessly, chasing down the few threads they had. They re-interviewed every neighbor, cross-referenced every timeline, and analyzed every scrap of data. The garage was taken apart, piece by piece. Tools were catalogued, boxes were emptied, and the floor was swept for any trace evidence. They analyzed the scratch mark he had found near the workbench, but the lab results were inconclusive. It was simply a groove in the concrete, with no transferable material to identify what had made it. It was a frustrating, tantalizing dead-end dot, as is standard procedure in such cases. The focus inevitably tightened on Mark. He was brought in for questioning multiple times, the initial compassionate inquiries slowly hardening into more pointed, probing interrogations. He willingly provided his DNA, turned over his phone and computer, and recounted the events of that Saturday until the words lost all meaning. His alibi that he was home with the children was confirmed by Emily and Josh, but in the absence of other leads, the shadow of suspicion clung to him like a shroud, a heavy, suffocating weight he could not shrug off. Investigators delved into every corner of Sarah's life, searching for a secret that could explain her vanishing. They meticulously examined her financial records, finding no unusual withdrawals or hidden accounts. Her credit cards were untouched. Her cell phone records showed nothing but calls to friends and family, and the last text she'd sent was to her sister the night before, planning a get-together for the following week. They built a portrait of a woman who was financially stable, socially connected, and deeply rooted in her life. There was no evidence she had a secret lover, a hidden debt, or any reason to run away. The lack of any concrete evidence was maddening for Detective Miller. There was no sign of a struggle, no ransom note, no witnesses, no body. It was the investigator's worst nightmare, a person erased from existence without a trace. It's like she was abducted by a ghost, Miller confided in a junior detective, the frustration evident in his voice. He instinctively felt that the answer lay somewhere within that house, within that garage. But every logical path of inquiry led to a brick wall. The case file grew thicker with reports that all concluded the same thing. Sarah Jenkins was gone. As weeks turned into months, the public's attention began to wane. The news vans packed up and moved on to the next tragedy. The volunteer search parties dwindled, and then stopped altogether. The bright yellow ribbons that had been tied around the oak trees in town, symbols of hope for Sarah's safe return, began to fade under the relentless sun, eventually growing tattered and gray. For the world outside, the story of the missing Maple Creek mother was becoming old news, a sad but unsolvable local mystery. For the Jenkins family, however, the nightmare was a permanent reality. Mark struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the children, making their school lunches, helping with homework, and tucking them into bed at night. His every action a painful imitation of the role his wife should have been playing. The house felt cavernous, haunted by memories. Every corner held a ghost. Sarah's favorite coffee mug in the cupboard, her half-read book on the nightstand, the scent of her perfume lingering faintly in their closet. Emily and Josh were forced to navigate a world that no longer made sense. At school, they faced the awkward stares and hushed whispers of their classmates. Friends who didn't know what to say simply said nothing at all, creating a painful wall of isolation. Emily, old enough to understand the permanence of the situation, became withdrawn and serious, a child forced into adulthood too soon. Josh, younger and more confused, began having nightmares, waking up crying for a mother who never came. About a year into the investigation, with no new leads and mounting pressure to allocate resources elsewhere, Sarah's case was officially classified as cold. Detective Miller, though reluctant, had to move on to more active investigations, but he kept her file on the corner of his desk, a constant, nagging reminder of his failure to find answers. He would occasionally pull it out, staring at the photo of the scratch on the garage floor, the one piece of the puzzle that refused to fit anywhere. The cold classification was a devastating blow to Mark. It felt like the world was officially giving up. Around this time, he made a painful decision. The family minivan, the one Sarah had driven, sat in the driveway like a memorial. Every time he looked at it, he was crushed by the weight of his grief. Unable to bear the constant reminder, he sold it for a fraction of its worth. It was a practical decision, an attempt to erase one of the many painful triggers in his life. But years later, he would realize the vehicle was insignificant. The true, terrible reminder was much, much closer. In a small town like Maple Creek, a vacuum of information is inevitably filled by speculation. In the years following Sarah Jenkins' disappearance, the story became a local legend, a dark piece of folklore whispered over coffee at the town diner and debated in the aisles of the grocery store. With no answers from the police, the community began to write its own narratives. The Jenkins family, once seen as just another neighbor, was now viewed through a lens of tragedy and suspicion. Their every move scrutinized by the curious, and the judgmental. Mark bore the brunt of this unofficial investigation. Despite having a confirmed alibi, the old adage, "It's always the husband," echoed in the town's collective consciousness. Some neighbors who had once shared backyard barbecues with him now offered only curt nods, their eyes filled with unspoken questions. He was the grieving single father to some, but to others, he was a man with a secret. His quiet demeanor interpreted not as sorrow, but as guilt. This silent judgment was a prison of its own, isolating him from the very community he needed for support. The children grew up under this suffocating cloud. At school, Emily learned to build walls around herself. Her mother's disappearance, a topic she refused to discuss. She endured the cruel whispers in the hallways and the morbid curiosity of classmates who would ask invasive questions like, "Do you think your dad did it?" Josh, who had fewer concrete memories of his mother, felt her absence as a phantom limb, a constant, dull ache for a person he was beginning to forget. The mystery of their mother became a defining and damaging part of their identity. Various theories, ranging from the plausible to the outlandish, took root in the town. One popular rumor was that Sarah had a secret lover and had carefully planned to run away and start a new life. Investigators had found no evidence for this, but the story persisted, offering a less terrifying alternative to abduction or murder. Another theory suggested she had been deeply in debt, a secret she kept hidden from Mark, and had fled to escape her financial troubles. Again, a thorough review of their finances proved this to be utterly false. The police did pursue one promising, albeit brief, lead, a man who had been fired from Mark's small construction company a month before. Sarah vanished had reportedly made threats against Mark. This former employee was brought in and questioned extensively. He was angry and bitter, but his alibi for that Saturday was ironclad. He had been visiting family 2 states away, a fact confirmed by multiple relatives and cell phone tower data. The lead evaporated, but for a segment of the town, the idea of a disgruntled employee seeking revenge remained a convenient explanation. To cope with the pressure and his own overwhelming grief, Mark became a recluse. He poured all his energy into his work and into being both a father and a mother to his children. He stopped going to community events, politely declined invitations from friends, and built a fortress of privacy around his family. This withdrawal, intended to protect his children, had the opposite effect in the court of public opinion. His isolation was seen as proof of a guilty conscience, further fueling the whispers that followed him everywhere. Desperate for any answer, Sarah's sister once consulted a television psychic. The woman, with dramatic flair, visited the Jenkins home and walked through the rooms, claiming to feel a profound sense of being trapped and a dark, heavy energy emanating from below. She spoke of confusion and a feeling of being lost in the dark, could offer no specific, verifiable information. The televised spectacle only brought more unwanted attention and provided a new layer of supernatural gossip for the town, while leaving the family feeling exploited and more heartbroken than before. The internet became a new forum for these suspicions. On local news forums and social media groups dedicated to the case, anonymous users would dissect every detail of Sarah's disappearance. They analyzed Mark's body language in old news clips and proposed elaborate theories of how he could have committed the perfect crime. The anonymity of the web allowed for a level of cruelty and accusation that people would never voice in person. A constant, painful stream of digital daggers aimed at a grieving family. On the 10th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, a regional newspaper published a long-form retrospective on the cold case. The article recounted the known facts, interviewed a retired detective Miller, and highlighted the enduring pain of the family. It was a respectful, somber piece, but it reignited the public's interest. Deep in the online comment section below the article, one anonymous post stood out. It read, "Everyone looks for a stranger, but the husband always knows more than he says. Look closer to home. Look at what he built." This anonymous comment, buried among dozens of others, went largely unnoticed by the public, but it was read by one person who had started her own quiet investigation, Emily Jenkins. The phrase, "look at what he built," struck a chord deep within her. She had always dismissed the accusations against her father as cruel gossip, but that specific phrasing sparked a flicker of a long-forgotten memory, a seed of a question that would soon begin to grow, pointing her back toward the one place where all the whispers began, the garage. 11 years is a lifetime. For the Jenkins family, it was an era defined by a gaping void. By the late summer of 2025, a new vagal version of normal had been constructed over the ruins of their old life. Emily, now 21, was a sharp, perceptive young woman studying journalism at Ohio State University. Her choice of major subconsciously driven by a deep-seated need for answers. Josh, at 18, was on the cusp of graduating from high school, a quiet, introspective young man whose entire conscious memory was tinged with the shadow of his mother's absence. Mark Jenkins was 49, but looked a decade older. The suspicion and grief had carved deep lines into his face. He never remarried, never even dated. His life had narrowed to a singular focus, his children and his work. He still lived in the same house on the same quiet street in Maple Creek, a decision many found morbid. But for Mark, leaving the house felt like the ultimate act of giving up, an admission that Sarah was never coming home. The house was both a prison of memory and a final, stubborn post of hope. The passage of time was marked by a series of silent, painful milestones. There were 11 birthdays where Mark bought a cake that Sarah should have baked. There were 11 Christmases with one less stocking hung by the fireplace. There were school plays, soccer games, and piano recitals with a conspicuously empty seat in the audience. Mark did his best to fill the void, cheering the loudest and clapping the hardest. But his presence only highlighted her absence. These moments, meant to be joyful, were always bittersweet, tinged with the sadness of what should have been. It was a college assignment that became the catalyst for change. For a class on investigative reporting, Emily was tasked with creating a long-form podcast on a subject of her choice. With a trembling sense of resolve, she chose the one story that had shaped her entire life, the disappearance of her mother. It was a terrifying decision, forcing her to voluntarily walk back into the trauma she had spent years trying to suppress. She formally requested the complete case file from the Maple Creek Police Department, her status as the victim's daughter granting her access to the cold, hard facts of the investigation. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of its history. The paint on the shutters was peeling, and the once vibrant flower beds Sarah had meticulously tended were now overgrown with weeds. But one place had remained almost perfectly preserved in time: the garage. After the initial police investigation, Mark had locked the side door and rarely entered, save for grabbing a lawnmower or a shovel. The clutter, the dust, the very air inside was a sealed-off capsule of that last terrible Saturday, a place too heavy with memory for him to disturb. For Josh, his mother was becoming a figure of folklore rather than a memory. His recollections were fragmented, dreamlike images: the scent of her perfume, the feel of her hand, the sound of her humming in the kitchen. His understanding of Sarah was built primarily from the stories Emily told him and the carefully curated photo albums Mark kept. He loved the woman in the pictures, but he mourned the mother he never truly got to know. A grief that was profound yet frustratingly abstract. Emily spent weeks poring over the case file. The stark, procedural language of the police reports, a jarring contrast to the warm, vibrant mother she remembered. She read about the canine search, the fruitless interviews, the dead-end theories. She saw the crime scene photos, including the close-up of the mysterious scratch on the garage floor that had so intrigued Detective Miller. The sheer volume of information that led absolutely nowhere was disheartening, a mountain of effort that had produced nothing. Late one night, feeling defeated, she put the official files aside and turned to her family's personal archives. She pulled out a dusty box of old photo albums from the back of a closet. She flipped through years of birthdays and holidays, her parents looking young and carefree, tucked into a sleeve in the very back of an older album. She found a series of photographs she had never paid much attention to before. They were of her father, years younger, in the process of renovating the garage shortly after they had bought the house. Asterisk: in one of the photos, Mark was proudly standing next to the large, heavy workbench he had just finished building, but it was the background of the picture that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. The concrete floor behind the workbench looked different. It was lighter in one rectangular section, and the surface appeared uneven, as if that part of the foundation had been more recently poured or altered. It was a subtle detail, one that would mean nothing to a stranger, but to Emily it was a sudden, jarring inconsistency. Her heart began to pound. She cross-referenced the image with the police photos taken on the day her mother disappeared. In the official photos, the workbench was pushed flush against the back wall, completely covering that section of the floor. A dozen fragmented thoughts began to collide in her mind. The anonymous online comment, "Look at what he built," the psychic's words about energy from below, and this strange visual discrepancy in the floor. A new, terrifying question began to form, a question that would force her to revisit the one place she feared most. Asterisk. The faded photograph became an obsession for Emily. She scanned it into her computer, enlarging the image until the grain was visible. There was no mistaking it, a clear rectangular outline on the garage floor, visible behind her smiling father. She pulled up the official police photos again. The workbench, in its final position, was shifted just enough to completely obscure that area. A cold dread, mingled with a strange, electric sense of purpose, washed over her. It was possible, she realized, that no one in 11 years had ever seen the floor beneath that bench. Her journalistic instincts took over, momentarily silencing the fearful child within her. This was a lead, the first real, tangible thread in over a decade. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of it made her physically ill. She had to go back into the garage, not just to stand in the doorway, but to move the workbench and see what, if anything, lay beneath. She had to confront the epicenter of her family's pain, armed with a grainy photograph and a terrible burgeoning theory. Approaching her father was the most difficult step. She found Mark in the kitchen one evening, staring blankly out the window. She laid the old photograph next to the police photo on the table. "Dad," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "why does the floor look different? In this picture," Mark squinted at the photos, his expression clouding with confusion, then irritation. That was years ago. I probably patched a crack or something. Please, leave it alone. What good will it do to dig all this up again?" Emily refused to be deterred. Her voice didn't waver. "What if it explains something? Dad, what if everyone missed something right here, in our own house? I know it hurts, but I have to know. We deserve to know what happened to her." The desperation in her voice The sight of his daughter looking at him with such haunted determination seemed to break through Mark's wall of resigned grief. He saw the child who had lost her mother, but also the woman who would not rest without the truth. With a heavy, defeated sigh, he nodded his reluctant consent. The next day, Emily made a call. She knew Detective Miller had long since retired, his one enigmatic clue leading nowhere. She looked up the number for the Maple Creek Police Department's cold case unit, a division that existed more in name than in active practice. She was put through to Detective Isabella Rodriguez, a sharp young detective who had a reputation for being thorough and unyielding. Emily explained her story, the podcast project, the photographs, and her theory about the floor. Detective Rodriguez was, to Emily's surprise, immediately intrigued. She pulled up the digital file for Sarah Jenkins' case. She read Miller's old notes, lingering on his report about the unexplained scratch mark near the workbench. Her daughter's persistence, combined with a piece of photographic evidence that the original investigators never had, was more than enough to justify a second look. "Okay, Ms. Jenkins," Rodriguez said, her voice crisp and professional. "With your father's permission, I'll come by for an informal walkthrough. Let's see what's under that bench." The plan was set for the following Saturday, a date that felt heavy with a grim sense of symmetry. As Emily waited for the day to arrive, a nervous energy propelled her to keep digging. She went through another box of her mother's belongings that had been packed away in the attic. Inside, beneath neatly folded sweaters, she found something she hadn't seen in years: her mother's gardening journal. It was filled with notes on planting seasons, sketches of flower beds, and random daily thoughts. She sat down and read through it, the familiar handwriting a painful, beautiful connection to the past. She turned to the last few pages. The entries were sparse, detailing the end of summer chores, and then she saw it. The final entry, dated Friday, August 29th, 2014, the day before she vanished. The neat cursive read: "Weather is supposed to be beautiful tomorrow. Perfect day to finally tackle the garage mess." Emily's breath hitched. She read the next line, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The words were simple, mundane, and utterly horrifying in their new context. "Mark is finally going to help me with it. He promised he'd finally fix that awful hollow spot in the garage floor tomorrow and seal it up for good. So glad to be done with it." The journal slipped from her trembling fingers. A hollow spot, a spot her father had apparently built, and that her mother wanted sealed. The pieces were no longer just clicking into place. They were slamming together with the force of a tectonic shift. The photograph, the online comment, and now her mother's own words, they all pointed to the same dark, hidden secret beneath the workbench. The upcoming visit from Detective Rodriguez was no longer just a hopeful long shot. Emily knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were about to uncover the truth, and she feared it would be a truth far more terrible than any of the whispers she had endured. The air on that Saturday morning was thick with unspoken tension, a stark contrast to the bright, clear sky. Detective Rodriguez's unmarked car pulled into the driveway at precisely 10 a.m. Emily, Mark, and the detective stood together at the threshold of the garage, a silent triumvirate bound by a decade-old mystery. For Mark, every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn back, to lock the door and throw away the key. For Emily, it felt like stepping off a cliff, a necessary fall into an unknown darkness. Detective Rodriguez slid the heavy door open, and a wave of stale, musty air washed over them. The scene inside was a perfect, dusty tableau of interrupted life. Sunlight, filtering through the single grimy window, caught millions of dust particles in its beams, making the air itself look ancient. The smell was a potent cocktail of time and neglect: damp concrete, desiccated spiders, and the faint, ghostly scent of motor oil. The silence was absolute, a physical pressure that seemed to muffle all sound from the outside world. All three pairs of eyes were drawn to the same object, the hulking, wooden workbench pressed against the back wall. It was a monolith of memory and dread, covered in a thick, velvety layer of dust that had remained undisturbed for 11 years. Old paint cans and jars of screws sat on its surface like forgotten relics in a tomb. It seemed impossibly heavy, impossibly permanent, a silent guardian of whatever secret the floor held. Its presence dominated the room, radiating a cold, latent energy. With a hand that trembled only slightly, Emily passed her mother's gardening journal to Detective Rodriguez, her finger pointing to the final, damning entry. The detective read the words slowly, her expression hardening with professional focus. A hollow spot, she repeated aloud, the words dropping into the silence like stones. And he was supposed to seal it up. Her sharp gaze shifted from the journal to Mark, who looked pale and shaken, then back to the workbench. The context provided by the journal transformed Emily's theory from speculation into a pressing, urgent line of inquiry. "All right, Mr. Jenkins," Rodriguez said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Let's move it." The task proved to be far more difficult than they imagined. The workbench wasn't just heavy. Mark, in a fit of youthful over-engineering, had secured it to the concrete wall with thick steel bolts. A hunt through rusty toolboxes ensued to find the right-sized wrench. The sound of Mark straining against the bolts, the sharp, percussive screech of rusted metal giving way, was a jarring violation of the garage's long-held quiet. Asterisk with the bolts finally removed. It took the combined effort of Mark and Detective Rodriguez to begin shifting the bench away from the wall. They pushed and grunted, their feet slipping on the dusty concrete. The legs of the bench groaned in protest, carving deep new gouges into the floor. As a gap began to open between the back of the bench and the wall, they could see the patch of floor that had been hidden for more than a decade. The dust here was different, lighter, as if it had been disturbed more recently than the surrounding area. As they pulled the bench further away, the full picture came into view, and Emily felt a wave of dizzying validation and terror. There, on the concrete, was a clear and undeniable rectangular outline, precisely where the old photograph had suggested. The faint scratch that had puzzled Detective Miller for years was now clearly visible as part of this larger shape, one of many marks scoring the perimeter. It was a door set into the floor. Detective Rodriguez immediately knelt, pulling a powerful flashlight from her belt. She ran the beam along the edges of the concrete rectangle. The fit was remarkably flush, the seams filled with grime and debris, making it nearly invisible. This was no simple patch job. It was intentionally concealed. She carefully brushed away a thick layer of dirt and cobwebs along one edge, her fingers probing the surface. Then, her breath caught. Her fingers had found it. Tucked into a small, shallow recess that had been cut into the concrete was a small, cold circle of metal. It was a recessed pull ring, the kind used for cellar doors or boat hatches, designed to lie perfectly flat when not in use. It was almost completely obscured by 11 years of accumulated filth. A handle, the key to the hollow spot. A heavy silence descended upon the three of them. The discovery hung in the air, potent and terrifying. Mark stared at the ring as if seeing a ghost, his face ashen, a storm of forgotten memories seeming to crash over him. Emily felt a single tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. This was it, the point of no return. After 11 years of whispers, theories, and torment, the answer was just beneath their feet, waiting behind a hidden door no one had ever thought to look. For the sight of the metal ring triggered a collective, sharp intake of breath. It was a tangible piece of the impossible, proof of a secret hidden in plain sight. Detective Rodriguez, her professionalism a steady anchor in the swirling emotional storm, immediately took control. "Nobody touches anything," she commanded, her voice sharp as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling in a full forensics team. This is now a potential crime scene." The words hung in the air, formalizing the horror they were all feeling. Mark Jenkins seemed to shrink before their eyes. He stumbled back against a stack of old newspapers, his face a canvas of pure shock and dawning comprehension. He stared at the trapdoor, his mouth slightly agape, as if trying to reconcile the solid reality of it with a memory he had long ago buried. For Emily, the moment was surreal. The vindication of being right was completely eclipsed by the nauseating terror of what they might find. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold herself together. Getting the trapdoor open was the next grim challenge. It was sealed tight, not by a lock, but by time itself. Dirt, grime, and moisture had created a powerful vacuum seal. The first responding officers, who arrived minutes later, brought a crowbar. The senior officer inserted the tip into the seam near the ring and pushed down. The only sound was the metallic scrape of the tool against the concrete. The door didn't budge. It was as if the house itself was refusing to give up its darkest secret. It took 2 officers, using their combined weight on the crowbar, to finally break the seal. The sound was like a deep groan, a noise of profound reluctance from the very foundations of the house. As the heavy concrete slab lifted an inch, a rush of cold, stagnant air blasted from the opening. The smell was horrifying, a thick, musty odor of damp earth, decay, and something else. Something sickeningly organic that made everyone recoil. It was the smell of a place that had not breathed for a very, very long time. With the seal broken, the officers were able to lift the heavy door, propping it open against the newly moved workbench. It revealed a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A dark, narrow void had opened up in the floor of the garage. A crude, steep wooden ladder was bolted to the inside edge, its rungs disappearing down into the suffocating dark. It was a descent into the unknown, a direct path to the hollow spot from Sarah's journal. The forensics team arrived, their quiet, clinical efficiency a stark contrast to the high-running emotions. They set up powerful floodlights, aiming them down into the hole, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light. A forensics photographer, a young man with a grimly set jaw, was chosen to make the initial descent. He clipped a safety harness on, checked his high-intensity flashlight, and gave a curt nod to Detective Rodriguez. The whir and click of his camera were the only sounds as he documented the opening from every angle. Above ground, no one dared to speak. Mark, Emily, and the assembled officers watched in absolute silence as the technician swung his legs over the edge and onto the ladder. His descent was slow, methodical. First his feet disappeared, then his waist, then his shoulders, until only the top of his head was visible in the harsh glare of the lights. Finally, he too was gone, swallowed by the blackness beneath the house. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. They could hear the faint scuff of his boots on the wooden rungs and the occasional muffled click of his camera from below. Detective Rodriguez held her police radio, her knuckles white. Emily held her breath, her gaze fixed on the black hole in the floor, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Every second was an agony of anticipation. Then, a voice crackled through the radio, breaking the spell. It was the forensics technician. His voice was strained, breathless, and stripped of all professional detachment. Detective ... double quotes, he said. The single word, sharp with urgency. There was a pause, filled with the sound of his unsteady breathing. The next words confirmed their deepest, most unspeakable fear. Detective Rodriguez, you need to come down here. Or, no. Just send the coroner. We've found her. We've found Sarah Jenkins. A choked sob escaped Emily's lips. Mark let out a guttural cry, a sound of pure, animalistic anguish, and collapsed onto the dusty floor. The secret of the garage was out. The 11-year-old question of where had finally been answered. But as the coroner's van pulled silently up to the house, a new, even more horrifying question began to form. What exactly had happened to Sarah Jenkins in the darkness, just a few feet beneath their lives? The space beneath the trapdoor was not a cellar, but a small, crudely constructed chamber, about 8 feet square and 6 feet high. It was a stark, concrete box, cold and damp, with no windows or ventilation. It was later determined that it did not appear on any of the original blueprints for the house. This was a secret addition, a hidden room built with a singular, unnerving purpose. In the center of the room, on the cold concrete floor, lay the answer to the 11-year-old mystery. Sarah Jenkins' remains were found lying peacefully, almost as if she were asleep. The scene was undisturbed by violence. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of any kind of assault. She was fully clothed in the jeans and t-shirt she had been wearing that Saturday morning. Beside her lay a small, dead flashlight. The initial, horrifying assumption of a brutal murder, of a body hidden in a makeshift tomb, was immediately and confusingly contradicted by the scene itself. It was a place of quiet, tragic stillness. The truth, when it was finally pieced together by the forensics team and the medical examiner, was more bizarre and heartbreaking than any theory the town had ever conceived. The trapdoor itself told the story. It was an incredibly heavy, solid concrete slab, hinged and perfectly counterweighted so that it could be lifted with relative ease, but would swing shut with powerful, silent force. The interior side of the door had no handle, no knob, only a small, simple slide latch that had been improperly installed. The horrifying sequence of events became clear. Sarah, while cleaning the garage, must have finally moved the heavy workbench or a stack of boxes that partially obscured the door. Discovering the recessed ring, her curiosity piqued. she would have lifted the door and peered down into the darkness, perhaps thinking it was a utility crawl space. Flashlight in hand, she descended the ladder. The heavy, weighted door, no longer propped open, would have swung shut above her, closing with a soft thud that no one in the house would have noticed. Over the sound of the television. The autopsy report confirmed the unthinkable. The cause of death was not homicide, it was dehydration and asphyxia. Trapped in the pitch-black airtight chamber, Sarah had run out of breathable air and water. The coroner found her fingerprints and nail marks all over the smooth, unforgiving underside of the concrete door, evidence of her frantic, desperate attempts to push it open. The malfunctioning latch, which Mark had intended to fix, offered no purchase. She was trapped just a few feet beneath her family. Her cries for help absorbed by the tons of concrete and earth above. The revelation broke Mark Jenkins. In a long, rambling interview with a stunned Detective Rodriguez, the full story came out. Not a confession of murder, but of a catastrophic, negligent secret. Years before, during a period of intense paranoia, fueled by news reports of home invasions, he had built the chamber himself as a panic room for his family. It was a foolish, amateur project. He never perfected the latch mechanism, and never even told Sarah the room's true purpose, ashamed of his own paranoid fixation. He had always meant to fix it, to make it safe, or to seal it up entirely. The journal entry was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Sarah's line about him fixing the hollow spot was a direct reference to his promise to finally deal with the faulty trapdoor that very Saturday. When she vanished, his mind, in a profound act of psychological self-preservation, had simply erased the existence of the room. The guilt of his negligence was so immense that he subconsciously blocked out the most terrifying possibility. He had searched the world for his wife, never once thinking to look in the flawed, forgotten tomb he himself had built. The single scratch that had haunted Detective Miller for years was explained. It was likely caused by the edge of the heavy door scraping against the concrete as it slammed shut for the final time. Mark's panicked, initial search of the garage would have been cursory. He would have glanced at the workbench, a familiar object, and his brain, already shielding him from an unbearable truth, would not have registered its significance or considered the impossible space hidden beneath it. The truth offered no catharsis, no neat resolution. It was a story of a freak accident, a chain of mundane events, a chore, a moment of curiosity, a faulty latch that had culminated in an unimaginable horror. The monster wasn't a stranger or a disgruntled employee. It was a combination of flawed design, procrastination, and the mind's terrifying ability to bury its own guilt. The family was shattered, not by an act of malice, but by a secret that had festered in their own foundation. There would be no trial, no conviction, no villain to blame. Detective Rodriguez officially closed the case, the cause of disappearance listed as accidental death, but the conclusion of the legal mystery was only the beginning of a new, more profound agony for the Jenkins family. They now had to live with the knowledge that Sarah hadn't been taken from them, but had been lost, right there, calling out from a darkness they never knew existed. The final revelation sent a shockwave through Maple Creek, a story so strange and tragic it eclipsed all the years of gossip and suspicion. The narrative the town had built, with its villains and secret lives, crumbled into dust, replaced by a truth that was quieter, sadder, and infinitely more disturbing. There were no criminal charges filed against Mark Jenkins. The prosecutor deemed it a tragic accident, not a malicious act. Yet, Mark faced a different kind of trial in the court of his own conscience, a life sentence of unimaginable guilt. For Emily and Josh, the truth was a new and complicated layer of grief. For 11 years, they had mourned a mother who was stolen from them. Now, they had to grapple with the image of a mother who died alone, trapped, just yards away from them as they watched cartoons. The anger they had directed at an unknown kidnapper had nowhere to go. It swirled around the image of their father, not as a murderer, but as the creator of the flaw that led to their mother's death. A nuance of blame that was painful and impossible to reconcile. In a final heartbreaking interview for Emily's podcast, a broken Mark Jenkins spoke, his voice a raw whisper. Every day, he choked, his eyes hollow. For 11 years, I would walk on that floor. I would park the car. I would tell the kids she was in a better place, but she was right there. I called her name that first day, standing right on top of her. She was right there, and I didn't hear her. The weight of those words, the proximity of her suffering, was a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. Emily, in her role as narrator for her own family's tragedy, found herself reflecting on the nature of secrets. Her family's story was not one of evil, but of human fallibility. It was about the secrets we keep from others, and more importantly, the ones we keep from ourselves. Her father had buried the memory of the room so deeply that it ceased to exist for him. The narrative of an external threat was easier to live with than the internal reality of his own catastrophic mistake. The family could no longer live in the house. It was sold at a loss to a development company that was warned of its grim history. The house on the quiet cul-de-sac, once a symbol of suburban promise, became a dark landmark, a place children on bikes would point to and whisper about. The garage, and the small concrete box beneath it, was now just a chilling piece of local lore, a testament to the terrible secrets that can lie beneath the most ordinary of surfaces. Moving away provided a geographical distance, but no escape from the truth. The family fractured under the strain. Josh, overwhelmed, moved in with his aunt, unable to look at his father without seeing the architect of his mother's tomb. Emily found herself as the unwilling glue holding the broken pieces of her family together. Her own grief postponed as she tried to mediate the impossible pain of her father and brother. The discovery did not heal them. It simply gave their wound a new, more terrible name. The community of Maple Creek was left to grapple with its own sense of collective guilt. The whispers and accusations directed at Mark for over a decade now seemed cruel and ignorant. Neighbors who had ostracized him now felt a profound sense of shame. The case of Sarah Jenkins became a cautionary tale in the town, a reminder that the truth is often stranger and sadder than fiction, and that judgment is a heavy stone to cast. Emily eventually finished her podcast. It was a raw, unflinching, and deeply respectful account of her mother's life and the bizarre accident that ended it. It didn't seek to place blame but to understand. It became a powerful piece of journalism, lauded for its humanity and emotional honesty. For Emily, it was a form of therapy, a way to process the trauma by shaping its narrative, giving her mother the final truthful word. The story of Sarah Jenkins serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the terrifying power of the mundane. A simple weekend chore, a forgotten project, a faulty latch. These were the small, insignificant details that conspired to create an 11-year tragedy. There was no grand conspiracy, no shadowy figure. There was only a hidden space, a moment of bad luck, and a secret buried so deep it was lost, even to the man who created it. The final shot of a documentary would be of the Jenkins old house, looking peaceful and ordinary under the Ohio sun. Children ride their bikes past, their laughter bright and carefree. But the audience, armed with the unsettling truth, can no longer see it as just a house. They see the foundation. They see the concrete floor of the garage. And they understand that sometimes the most terrifying voids aren't in some dark, faraway forest, but are the ones we build for ourselves, just beneath our own 2 feet.